Welcome to Revenge Oath. Tonight, we descend into one of Sherlock Holmes's most chilling puzzles, the case of the Snowbound Killer. A storm seals an inn in silence. A man is found strangled behind a locked door. And among the trapped guests, one killer breathes the same frozen air. But the deeper Holmes digs, the more he realizes the snow hasn't just buried footprints. It's buried in the truth itself. Your comments mean the world. Tell me where you're watching from today. Now, brace yourself and follow Holmes into the storm. It was in the bitter depth of that memorable winter, when the Thames took on the hue and a stillness of lead, and the very hansoms clattered over the pavements with a glassy ring, that a singular case first presented itself at our humble quarters in Baker Street. Snow had fallen for 3 days unremittingly. London lay under a pall that seemed at once to brighten the city's grime and smother its usual vitality. The street lamps burned like dim orange buttons in the mist, and the muffled world moved with the tentative caution of men crossing a frozen pond. Holmes had, as it happened, been uncommonly languid. The cold drove him to his violin in fits and starts. He had spent the morning stretched at full length upon the settee, a heap of newspapers within reach like the scattered plumage of some enormous bird. I had just contrived a small fire, coaxing obstinate coals with that physician's patience which serves one equally well at the hearth and the bedside, when there came a knock, firm, deliberate, and so sharp against the hush that the sound seemed to splinter the frost. "Lestrade," said Holmes, without moving his head. He keeps his gloves on when he knocks in winter, a habit born of duty and chilblains. I confess the prediction did not astonish me, for our familiar ally from Scotland Yard had more than once broken in upon our domestic solitude with tidings of that peculiar variety which my friend termed the instructive misfortune. Yet even I was unprepared for the man who entered. The lean form, frosted eyelashes, and the expression which in Lestrade signified not only professional disquiet, but something bordering on superstitious dread. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson?" He stamped the snow from his boots and would have apologized for the damp if urgency had not driven the civility from his mind. "I take the liberty of calling at an unseemly hour, but I've an affair on hand that, well, I don't mind telling you, sir, it's put the Yard in a mortal puzzle." Holmes lifted himself upon one elbow. "Pray warm yourself, Lestrade. Your words thaw faster than your fingers." He inclined his long white hand toward the fire. "Now, what spectre has visited the metropolis?" "Not the metropolis, Mr. Holmes. Hampton-on-Wye, out towards the northwest, a mile from the last junction on the branch line, if that line can be said to exist, seeing it's under several feet of snow. A death last night at the King's Morrow Inn. A gentleman, Mr. Percival Hartwright, a silk merchant of high standing, found strangled in his private parlour. The door bolted upon the inside, the single window latched, shutters hooked, chimney too narrow for anything but a Christmas mouse. Not a mark of entry, and outside in the yard, nothing but a white blanket clean as a sheet on wash day, save for the victim's own footprints leading to the door. No second set coming or going. The place is bottled up with snow, and yet there he lies, as dead as any man in Newgate." Holmes's eyes, which had been hooded with indifference, narrowed with the first keen gleam of interest I had seen that week. "A strangulation, you say? With what instrument?" "That's part of the trouble." Lestrade swallowed. "There's a cord around the neck, a thin braided piece of silk, strong and smooth as the devil's whisker, but the knot is unlike any I've seen. And there's something more." He hesitated and produced from his pocket a small twist of paper. In its fold lay a single snowdrop blossom, still damp, its white bells unbruised as if plucked from some sheltered garden at the very instant of presentation. "A snowdrop," I said, "at this time of year." "At this time of weather," Lestrade returned grimly. "King's Morrow lies in a bowl of drifts. Hedge to hedge is buried. Where a man could have got a flower, well, that's one riddle. There's another." He lowered his voice despite our solitude. "The landlady swears the guest rang for hot broth at 9:15. The maid took it up, found the door bolted, left it on the mat, and heard him moving about inside. By past, there's no sound. They wait. Folk will always wait for trouble to announce itself. And at 10 they forced the door with the help of 2 carriers stranded by the snow. Mr. Hartright is on the carpet, already gone. And on the inside of the window pane," Lestrade's mouth hardened, "a pattern traced with a fingertip on the frost, 3 small arcs interlocked like a child's drawing of links in a chain." Holmes rose then and began to pace in that noiseless, feline fashion which always presaged activity. The violin lay forgotten on the table, the newspapers in a disordered hill. He halted at our window and with the nail of his forefinger drew upon the vapour a trio of overlapping loops. So, not letters, not numbers, but a figure, simple, memorable, and suggestive. Chain links, you say? A tradesman in silk, braiding loops, ha ha! He turned, the ghost of a smile under his keen grey eyes. "Pray continue." "There's little else to tell as yet," Lestrade replied. "The wires are down beyond Harrow. We've no easy means to summon aid or make inquiries, but there is this. The inn is full of a sort. 2 carriers, as I mentioned, a widow travelling to Northampton stopped by. The line's closure, a gentleman in clerical dress who says he is bound for a funeral in Shropshire, and a foreign fellow with a valise and an accent I should call German. The landlady, Mrs. Trent, her maid, the ostler, and a scullion boy make up the house. They're all snowed tight. The road is impassable, so I thought, if ever there was a time for your eye, Mr. Holmes." "You did wisely," said Holmes. "A house sealed by the weather is a laboratory closed against contamination. It preserves its facts as a fly in amber. When did this occur?" "Between 9 and 10 last night." "And now it is 11 in the morning." Holmes glanced at our clock. "Very well. We shall lose what little warmth the day affords, but we must gain the remnants of the night." "Watson!" "I am at your service," said I, already reaching for the bag, which by long habit I kept stocked for the unexpected. Holmes's gaze returned to the snowdrop upon our table. He took up the paper and held the bloom delicately, as a microscopist might handle a rare specimen. "There is a vicious paradox about snow," he murmured, half to himself. "It hides everything and betrays everything. A flower upon such a field is either a sanctity or a taunt." He looked sharply at Lestrade. "And Mr. Hartright? Married?" "A wife at Bayswater, no children, successful, respectable, and by all accounts temperate. He carried with him a ledger and a small iron-bound cash-box. The box is there, locked. The ledger, too, neat as a clerk's Sunday collar. Robbery then stands in the back of the room with its hat in its hand," Holmes observed dryly. "It may be invited forward later. Tell me of the cord." Lestrade drew a length from his pocket, enclosed in a handkerchief. Holmes lifted it with a pair of forceps from the mantelpiece, which he kept for such small examinations, and inspected it beneath the lamplight. "Not English manufacture," he said after a moment. "Twisted of 4 strands double-laid, smooth polished, and the knot, His brows knit. "The murderer has written his name in 2 places, first upon the window and next in the turn of this knot. He who knows how to read such signatures has already shaken hands with the man." He dropped the cord back upon the handkerchief. "Lestrade, have you secured the room?" as well as one can. I put the carriers in the passage and told the landlady she'd answer for any tampering with her liberty. They're all frightened stiff, Mr. Holmes. The wind moans round that inn like a ghost with a grievance. Holmes's teeth flashed. Excellent. We shall take the 1 o'clock train as far as the plough can push. And beyond that, Watson, you have your stout boots? Good. Lestrade, send a boy at once to the station with a message for a special. I shall wire Mycroft to oblige the line if persuasion fails, but I imagine the promise of a swift conclusion will satisfy their sense of economy, better than my brother's sense of authority. Lestrade stood, clearly relieved that the burden of his bewilderment might soon be shared. I don't mind saying, he added, almost sheepishly, that there's a mood about the place. They've christened it already. The papers will too if they get wind. The Snowbound Killer, they're calling it. Holmes's expression grew grave. He slipped the snowdrop into the empty neck of a small bottle on the mantel. An oddly tender gesture for a man whose sympathies usually lodged in the realm of reason. Names are dangerous things, he said. They invite a story to fit them, and a story may be made to fit any man. We shall prefer facts. Facts are not so easily coaxed. The wind plucked at the eaves, a flurry rattled the panes. Holmes fetched his ulster and deerstalker. I, for my part, secured the bag, and the revolver which experience had taught me was a more constant friend than pride would allow a physician to confess. Within the hour we were jolting through a city, white to its very chimney pots, the train labouring like some dark beetle tunnelling beneath a sheet. The world beyond the carriage window was a perpetually shifting curtain of grey and pearl, the rails themselves intermittently lost, found, and lost again. Holmes, once committed to a course, lapsed into that immaculate silence, which in him denoted not fatigue, but concentration. Only once, as we changed at a station where the platform boy's breath hung in ghostly tatters, did he turn to me. Observe, Watson, he said, nodding at a porter's scarf. The method by which the simplest braid resists fray, loop interlocked with loop, a language of knots and links used by those who must trust their weight to their understanding. Sailors speak it fluently, so do others who cannot afford a loose end. You think the knot is the essence of the matter? I asked. I think, my dear fellow, that the murderer believed himself snowproof. Only a fool is weatherproof. And the difference between a fool and a clever man, he added, with that thin smile of his, is the interval in which we catch him. The engine whistled, a forlorn cry, swallowed by the white and the wind. Ahead lay Hampton-on-Wye, the King's Morrow Inn, and a parlour sealed by frost and fear. Behind us, London receded into an indistinct blur, as if someone had drawn a glove across the city's face. We plunged on through the blizzard toward a death locked from within, and a flower that had no right to bloom. The train laboured onward through the white wilderness, a black iron worm tunnelling under a shroud of silence. As we drew farther from the city, the tracks vanished beneath a soft, persistent drift, and the wind howled like some forgotten beast prowling the moors. The guard came by twice, each time warning that the line ahead was nearly impassable. Holmes, unmoved, sat with his chin upon his chest, the brim of his deerstalker shadowing, eyes that burned with restless thought. At last, near dusk, the train lurched to a halt at what the conductor called Hampton Halt, mere platform half buried under snow. Beyond it, the road was but a pale scar running into a forest of frost-bitten pines. Lestrade cursed softly. We'll have to go on foot. There's a man from the village with a sledge for the luggage, but no horse alive would face this drift. Holmes rose, stretching his long limbs. Excellent. The fewer wheels, the fewer tracks to confuse us. Lead on. The three of us struck out along the road. the wind cutting like knives through our coats. Night had fallen fully by the time a faint yellow glow appeared ahead. The King's Morrow Inn, crouched beneath its burden of snow like some weary traveller. The sign creaked in the gale, its painted crown half obscured by ice. A lantern flickered by the door, and the landlady, Mrs. Trent, met us with a pale, anxious face. "Thank heaven you've come, Inspector. It's a dreadful thing, dreadful. I've not slept since last night." Her hands trembled as she held the door open, and the smell of smoke and broth rolled out into the cold. Holmes removed his gloves and coat without haste. "Compose yourself, madam. Fear distorts memory. We shall need yours clear. Take us to the room, if you please." The inn was small but solidly built, its passageways lined with dark wood, and the faint scent of wet wool. All seemed still, save the crackle of the fire and the occasional groan of wind through the eaves. Mrs. Trent led us up a narrow stair and along a corridor where the boards creaked beneath our boots. At the far end, she stopped before a door, heavy oak, iron latch, and a bolt upon the inside. It was here, she whispered, that Mr. Hartright had been found. Lestrade produced a key. "We forced the lock this morning for the coroner's man, then replaced it after. No one's been in since." "Then allow me," said Holmes, and with a deft twist he pushed open the door. The air that greeted us was chill, still heavy with the faint odour of extinguished fire and something more, an acrid trace, metallic and unpleasant. The room itself was neat, but for the overturned chair and the mark where the body had lain. The hearth was nearly cold. On the table stood the untouched bowl of broth, frozen round the rim. Holmes's gaze darted from object to object, missing nothing. He stooped to examine the carpet, then the latch, then the small frost-misted window where Lestrade had said the mark was found. "There," murmured the inspector, pointing. Indeed, on the glass was the faint outline of 3 loops, traced by a human finger upon the frozen surface. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Preserved perfectly, not the tremor of fear in that line, a steady hand and deliberate. He drew a magnifying lens from his pocket and leaned close. The mark was made from within, immediately before death. The warmth of the finger melted the frost, but did not run. Thus the room was cold and the act intentional. Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. He examined the latch. Fastened securely from the inside, window unforced, chimney narrow, a classic impossibility. "Watson, your verdict on the cause of death?" I knelt by the faint, dark stain on the carpet. The marks of the cord suggest strangulation from behind. The victim struggled briefly, but not far. See the overturned chair and displaced rug. There are no signs of a weapon or blunt trauma. "Excellent," Holmes said softly. A quick, silent act in a sealed room. The murderer either vanished like a phantom or never left at all. At this, Mrs. Trent gave a startled gasp. "You mean he could still be here?" Holmes turned to her with that quiet assurance which carried more command than any shout. "Madam, you have nothing to fear. The killer is bound not by this snow but by his own design. It is our task to find the thread he thought invisible." He moved then to the hearth, brushing a hand across the ash. No fire since the evening, yet the grate is clean, freshly swept. Curious. Who attended to this? "The maid, sir. Maisie. She tends the rooms each morning." "Send her to me." As Mrs. Trent hurried away, Holmes glanced toward the small table where the iron-bound cash box and ledger rested. "And Lestrade? Have you examined these?" "Only the exterior. The box is locked tight. The key was in the victim's waistcoat pocket. Ledgers ordinary, figures, addresses, shipment notes." Holmes flipped open the ledger, scanning the neat columns until he paused upon one page. "Ah, An entry from 3 days past, delivery 40 yards of lion braid, client, initials EK, and below it, paid in full personal account, no address, no signature. Odd that a merchant so precise should omit his buyer. The door opened then, and a timid girl of 16 entered, curtsying awkwardly. Her hands were red from scrubbing, her eyes wide with fear. "You tended this room?" Holmes asked gently. "Yes, sir. I cleaned it the morning before the snow came. After he died. I've not been near it." "Did you place any flowers here, or notice any?" She shook her head quickly. "No, sir. Not a one. Only the snow outside." Holmes inclined his head. "That'll do. You've been most helpful." When she had gone, he turned back to Lestrade. "No flowers in the inn, yet one was left upon the body, a snowdrop, a token rare enough in this storm to speak louder than words." He paced slowly, then stopped before the window. 3 loops on the glass, a braided cord, a merchant of silk. The murderer speaks in his own trade. And somewhere within this house, his gaze sharpened. One of your snowbound guests understands that language far too well. Outside, the wind wailed through the darkness, and the shutters rattled like chains. Holmes lingered by the window, his gaze fixed upon the faint marks in the frost, as though the very essence of the mystery hung suspended there. Lestrade shifted impatiently, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. "It's all well and good to admire the view, Mr. Holmes," he muttered, "but we've 4 suspects downstairs, each with a tale that could keep us here till the thaw." Holmes turned slowly. 4? Then we shall begin with the 5th. "The 5th?" Lestrade frowned. "There are only 4 guests." "Precisely. The 5th is not listed among them, yet his handiwork is here." Holmes gestured toward the braided cord on the mantelpiece. "The knot speaks of familiarity with tension and balance, a seaman's hand or that of a craftsman accustomed to weaving, a man who knows the strength of his own material, who ties for security, not ornament. Such a one would not appear in your registry, Inspector, but he exists all the same." Before Lestrade could respond, Holmes motioned to the window. "You will note, Watson, the faint smudge at the lower frame. The frost there has melted irregularly, not from within but from contact with something warm. Perhaps a hand pressed against the pane. Whoever drew these loops may have steadied himself there before or after the act. It suggests height. The killer was tall or else stood upon something." I followed his gaze and saw indeed the faint outline of a palm. "But the door was bolted, Holmes. How could he have escaped?" "That," he replied with a faint smile, "is the very question our killer wished us to ask." Holmes crouched before the hearth, examining the soot-stained brickwork. His long fingers traced the inner lip of the grate. "Do you see, Watson? The sweep was recent but not thorough. This smudge, oil, not ash. And here, a faint impression, circular, a candlestick base pressed into the soot. Yet there is no candle now upon the mantel." Lestrade crossed his arms. "So, he took it with him?" Holmes rose sharply. "Not he, she. Or rather, the person who entered after the deed was done. Someone tidied the scene, fearing discovery. Tell me, Inspector, were all your guests accounted for at the time of death?" Lestrade frowned. "The landlady swears none left their rooms, though the maid heard footsteps overhead. After midnight, she assumed it was the carriers checking the roof for leaks. The snow was heavy, made every sound strange." Holmes nodded, then moved toward the door. "We shall speak with them all in turn, but not as Lestrade the inspector or Holmes the detective. No, tonight we are weary travellers seeking warmth and talk. Men reveal more over supper than they do under oath." Within half an hour we were seated in the inn's common room, where the fire burned bright, and the smell of mulled wine mingled with wet wool and candle smoke. The assembled company looked up as we entered, a curious gathering indeed. Closest to the fire sat a stout widow in mourning, black, knitting furiously, her lips pursed in concentration. Beside her, a clergyman of pale complexion and downcast eyes, his cassock still damp at the hem. At the far table, two rough-looking carriers nursed their ale in silence. And near the window, half turned from the rest, a man of sharp features and curling moustache sat polishing a pair of spectacles. His accent, when he spoke, marked him at once as foreign. "Gentlemen," Holmes said pleasantly, "I trust we are not intruding. The roads are unkind this evening." The widow sniffed. "Unkind? They're murder, sir. If Providence had meant us to travel in such weather, he'd have given us snowshoes instead of sense." The foreigner smiled faintly. "Ah, but one finds beauty in the hardship, madam. The snow hides all ugliness." Holmes's eyes flicked toward him with interest. "A poetic view, Mr. Le?" "Ernst Keller," the man replied, his Germanic consonants crisp. "A merchant passing through to Liverpool." At this, Lestrade stiffened almost imperceptibly. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A merchant indeed? Of what trade, Mr. Keller?" "Textiles," Keller said easily. "Braids, ribbons, fine silks, my stock travels lighter than most." I caught Lestrade's glance, sharp and questioning, but Holmes only inclined his head as though the reply had merely confirmed what he expected. "Then, sir, you will appreciate the art of knots, a skill not every man possesses." Keller's eyes met his, unflinching. "In my country, we learn early. A knot is trust. Tie it well, and it holds a life. Tie it poorly, and it kills." For a moment, silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Holmes smiled faintly. "A profound philosophy. You must tell me more of it. Later." He turned toward the widow. "And you, madam, are travelling alone?" "I am Mrs. Edith Lambert of Northampton. My late husband was a bookseller. I am returning home from visiting my sister in London." Her tone suggested she considered interrogation a form of insult. "I never knew the poor man upstairs. God rest him?" Holmes inclined his head courteously. "Indeed few do. Yet fate brings strange company under one roof. It is as though the snow itself chose its audience." The clergyman, who had been silent till now, murmured, "Perhaps the Almighty does not choose so lightly, sir." Holmes studied him for a heartbeat, then smiled thinly. "Perhaps not." He let the conversation drift to trivialities after that. Weather, travel, the uncertain promise of the morning. Yet I saw his gaze linger upon each guest, noting gesture, tone, and the smallest inconsistency. When at last the widow retired and the carriers shuffled off, Holmes leaned close to me and murmured, "Watson, the snow outside preserves no tracks, but the snow within, the kind that gathers in men's minds, leaves deeper prints. Mark me well, the man who tied that knot sits at this very table." Holmes sat, motionless after his quiet declaration, his eyes half-lidded, yet every nerve of him alive with concentration. The inn's common room had grown still, save for the low whistle of wind beneath the door. The remaining guests had retired, leaving only Keller at his table near the window, the last candle before him guttering low. He looked the picture of composure, yet there was something too deliberate about the ease of his movements, as though every gesture were weighed before being given. Holmes rose at last, murmuring softly, "Watson, it is time to examine what silence conceals. We shall let words rest for now and listen to what the house itself remembers." We left the warmth of the fire and climbed the narrow stairs once more. Lestrade followed, his lantern throwing long shadows along the passage. Holmes stopped at the threshold of the victim's room and motioned for the light to be lowered. "Observe," he said, his voice scarcely above a whisper. "Snow falls heavy upon the roof, yet here there is a faint ticking above us, not mechanical, but steady. A drip, perhaps?" I listened closely, and indeed there came a soft, rhythmic sound, distinct from the creaks of the building. Holmes nodded. Precisely, the melting of ice through a vent or gap. The murderer must have known the structure well enough to count upon the cold to conceal him. He stepped to the far wall and examined the beam above the window. "Watson, give me your cane." I passed it to him, and he used the end to tap lightly along the joinery. After several strikes, the hollow ring of wood gave way to a dull thud. "There," he breathed. "The ceiling hides a cavity, an old storage space, perhaps once used for luggage when this inn served coaches. A man might wait within it, unseen, until the moment he chose to descend." Lestrade raised his brows. "You think he dropped from the ceiling, strangled the victim, and returned above?" "A simple theory, yet too simple. No rope marks near the beam, no trace of dust displaced save one. Look closely." Holmes knelt and pointed to a faint streak along the plaster, ending just above the window frame. "A ladder or step was used here recently. Its base rested near the hearth. And what was placed by the hearth, Lestrade?" "The candlestick," cried the inspector. "Just so, the very one that has vanished." Holmes smiled thinly. "I fancy our killer used it not to light his way, but to gain height, balancing it against the wall to reach the vent. A bold improvisation, yet it tells us something more. This was not the act of a seasoned criminal. It was clever, but desperate." He stood and paced slowly. "Now consider Mr. Keller, a man of refinement, measured and calm, with fingers that know the weave of silk. He could tie a knot with elegance and ease. Yet such a man does not rely on improvised tools. No, this was another hand entirely. One that knew the trade, but not the discipline." "You mean an apprentice?" I ventured. Holmes's eyes glimmered. "An apt deduction, Watson. An assistant, perhaps one wronged or cast aside. The braid about the victim's neck was of Leon silk, the same city Keller mentioned. Coincidence is the refuge of fools. Let us see if the pattern continues." We returned downstairs to find Keller extinguishing his candle. He looked up, startled but composed as Holmes approached. "You retire early, Mr. Keller." "Yes, sir," he replied softly. "The storm makes for a long night. I prefer to sleep through it." Holmes regarded him with polite indifference. "You spoke earlier of trust in knots. Tell me, have you ever tied a lion braid in triple link form?" Keller's brows drew together slightly. "Triple link? It is a decorative braid, not for use. Why do you ask?" Holmes smiled, the expression one of mild apology. "A matter of curiosity. Good night, sir." We left him then, though I caught the faintest tightening of his jaw as he turned away. Outside the room, Holmes motioned me close. "Watson," he lied. "He knew the knot precisely, but I am less certain he tied it." Lestrade rubbed his chin. "Then who?" Holmes glanced up the staircase toward the servants' quarters. "A maid who tends the fires and knows where the tools lie. A hand small enough to climb, light enough to leave no trace, and one who fears her mistress more than justice." "You mean the girl? Maisie?" I whispered. Holmes nodded once. "We shall wake her before dawn. The truth, I suspect, will not wait for morning." Outside, the snow beat steadily against the shutters, and somewhere deep in the house a floorboard creaked, slow, deliberate, as though someone else was still awake, listening. The creak from above was slight, yet it rippled through the silence like a chill through still water. Holmes raised his hand for quiet, his head tilting ever so slightly toward the ceiling. The wind moaned outside, but beneath it came a second sound, softer, deliberate. the faint scuff of movement along the upper floor. Holmes's lips curved into a thin smile. "Our sleepless friend reveals herself," he murmured. He moved soundlessly toward the stair, every motion controlled and precise. Lestrade followed, lantern shaded, while I kept close behind, the boards sighing beneath our steps. The narrow passage at the top was dim and cold, the candle flames below casting long, shivering shadows up the wall. From the far end, a faint glimmer of light trembled beneath a half-open door. Holmes paused outside it and bent low, examining the floor. "The prints of bare feet," he whispered. "Small ones, recent. She walks without shoes, Watson, a habit of the guilty or the poor, in this case perhaps both." He pushed the door open with a gentle motion. Inside, the maid Maisie sat upon her narrow bed, clutching a blanket to her chest. A candle burned low beside her, and upon her lap lay a small wooden box, its lid open, to reveal scraps of cloth and thread, a few coins and a folded paper. At the sight of us, she gasped and rose, her eyes wide with fright. "Do not be alarmed," said Holmes softly. "No harm will come to you, child, if you speak the truth, but if you persist in silence, the gallows may find your tongue less useful than it is now." She trembled, glancing from Holmes to Lestrade. "I didn't kill him, sir. I swear it. I only—" Her voice faltered. Holmes stepped forward. "You only what?" "I only opened the door," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "He paid me to do it, Mr. Keller." Lestrade started, but Holmes merely inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "When was this?" "Last night, sir, just before the snow worsened. He said he'd left his papers inside, something important he must fetch from the gentleman's room. He gave me a shilling to unbolt the door once everyone was asleep. I didn't think it wrong." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And afterward?" She wrung her hands. I heard voices, quiet at first, then louder. A thud, like a chair falling. I was too frightened to look. When I crept back, the door was closed again. I locked it and ran. I swear, sir, I never saw what he did." Holmes regarded her in silence for a moment that stretched long and taut. Then he said gently, "And the snowdrop? Did you see it placed?" Her brow furrowed. "No, sir. But this morning, when I went to fetch water, I found something near the back door, a broken stem. I threw it in the fire." "A pity," Holmes murmured, turning away. "Truth burns as easily as flowers." He moved to the box upon her bed, glancing briefly inside. "You keep scraps of silk here?" "Yes, sir. From the ribbons Mr. Keller gave me. He said they were leftovers from his stock." Holmes closed the lid carefully. "Thank you, Maisie. You have done wrong, but not unforgivably. Stay in your room until I send for you." When we were back in the corridor, Lestrade could scarcely contain himself. "So that's it, then?" Keller bribed the girl, entered the room, strangled the man, and left before dawn. Holmes shook his head. "Too neat, Lestrade. Keller may have entered, yes, but I doubt he left so easily. Consider, the snow outside bore no footprints. The door was bolted and the window untouched. Keller could not have escaped unseen. Yet Maisie swears she locked the door afterward. Therefore, either Keller was still inside when the body was found, or someone else closed the scene behind him." I frowned. "Then who, Holmes?" "That," he said quietly, "is the knot we must untie." He descended the stairs with renewed purpose, his eyes glittering like cold steel. The common room was empty now, save for the fire, which had sunk to glowing embers. Holmes crouched before it, stirring the ashes with the poker until a faint glint caught the light, a sliver of metal half buried in soot. With a swift motion, he plucked it free. It was the missing candlestick, its base blackened, its side smeared with a reddish stain. Holmes examined it briefly, then looked up at us with that familiar, fierce gleam that meant revelation hovered near. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "our murderer was clever enough to let the snow conceal his path. But he's forgotten that fire, too, leaves footprints of its own. And this," he held up the twisted metal, "will tell us which hand dared strike through silk and snow alike." Holmes turned the candlestick over in his hands, his eyes narrowing as he studied the warped metal. The faint reddish smear caught the firelight, a dried trace that was not blood, but wax, tinted with something darker. "Curious," he murmured. "This candle did not burn clean. A foreign composition, perhaps mixed with resin. You see the residue along the rim, Watson? It speaks of hasty use. Someone melted the wax quickly, perhaps to fix or seal something." Lestrade leaned over his shoulder. "Seal what, Holmes? The door, the window?" "Neither," Holmes replied, rising to his feet. "A letter, or more likely, a package, but that is not its most telling feature." He held the candlestick close to the light. "Note this impression along the base, a curve, faint yet distinct. It matches the lower edge of the braid we found on the victim's neck. Our murderer set this very candlestick upright upon the floor, looped the cord over its stem and drew it tight, ingenious, silent, and brutal. He set it down with care and began pacing before the hearth. The question, gentlemen, is not how he strangled his victim, we have that, but when he did so. If the deed was done before the room was locked, our problem of escape vanishes. It becomes not a sealed room mystery, but one of deceit." Lestrade frowned. "You mean the man might have been dead before the maid brought the broth?" "Precisely," said Holmes. "The sound she heard, the movements inside, may not have been the victim at all, but another person imitating him. The broth, left untouched, serves to confirm that no living hand received it." I felt a chill pass through me. "Then the killer remained inside, pretending the victim still lived until he could slip out unseen?" Holmes's lips curved slightly. "Not remained, returned. The snow outside renders entry impossible, but within this inn there is more than one path between rooms. You recall, Watson, the hollow I discovered above the ceiling beam?" "Of course." "It adjoins the neighboring chamber. And who occupies that chamber?" Lestrade's face darkened. "Keller." Holmes nodded. "Exactly so. He could have entered the victim's room through the loft space, performed his grim work, then climbed back before dawn, leaving all bolted behind him. The pattern on the frost was his signature, a craftsman's flourish, unintentional perhaps, yet fatal." Lestrade struck his palm with his fist. "Then let's have him now." "Not yet," said Holmes calmly. "The truth, though near, is not whole. Keller's guilt is painted too plainly. It is as if someone wished it found." At that moment, a floorboard creaked near the passage. We turned sharply. A figure hovered there in the gloom, thin and spectral against the flickering firelight. It was the clergyman, the Reverend Coram. His face was ashen, his hands clasped before him. "Gentlemen," he said in a trembling voice, "I beg your pardon. I could not help but overhear. You are mistaken if you think that foreigner is the devil in this business. He is no killer." Holmes's gaze fixed upon him like a hawk's. "You speak with conviction, sir. Do you possess knowledge to support it?" The clergyman swallowed hard. "I do, because I saw another, someone standing outside that door after the scream." Lestrade's head snapped up. "A scream? None of the others mentioned it." Coram nodded. "A single cry, stifled, but clear enough. I had risen to fetch my Bible, for I could not sleep. I opened my door and saw a shadow pass along the corridor. A woman's shadow, I swear it." Holmes's eyes glinted. "A woman. and only one woman besides the maid resides here, Mrs. Trent." The Reverend hesitated. I would not accuse her. She was downstairs, I thought, but the shadow wore a shawl. Her maid does not." Holmes was silent for several seconds. Then, with that abrupt precision that always heralded a conclusion forming, he snatched the lantern from Lestrade's hand. "Watson, Lestrade, come. We shall pay our hostess a visit." We descended to the lower hall, where the wind battered the shutters like fists. Mrs. Trent stood at the kitchen door, her figure stiff, eyes wide as we approached. Holmes stopped before her, the lantern's glow cutting across her face. "Madam," he said evenly, "I must trouble you for a word. You spoke earlier of the poor merchant's death as a tragedy beyond comprehension, yet you omitted one detail, your debt to him. He was to foreclose upon this property within the week, was he not?" Her face went white as chalk. "Who told you that?" Holmes leaned closer, his voice no louder than a whisper. "No one, but the ledger upstairs did." She stared at him, trembling, the pretense of composure crumbling like frost beneath sunlight. Holmes's eyes never left her. The snow, the silence, the locked door, all meant to hide a desperate act, but snow melts, madam, and silence breaks. And as the wind roared through the chimney, Mrs. Trent gave a low, broken cry and sank to her knees before the fire. For a moment, no one moved. The wind keened through the cracks of the old inn, carrying with it the hiss of the snow outside, and Mrs. Trent's sobs filled the room with a strange, hollow rhythm. Holmes stood above her, his face unreadable, the lantern light drawing sharp lines across his angular features. Lestrade's instinct was immediate. He stepped forward and seized her arm. "So it's true then," he said, roughly. "You killed him to save your precious inn?" But Holmes's hand shot out, stopping him. "Gently, Inspector," he murmured. "We have yet to hear what she confesses to." The woman lifted her head, her tear-streaked face pale in the flickering glow. "I didn't kill Mr. Hartright," she gasped. "But God help me, I wished him dead. He'd have taken everything. This place, my livelihood, my father's name. He said if I couldn't pay, he'd see me turned out before the month was done." Her voice broke, and she pressed a trembling hand to her lips. "I only meant to frighten him, to beg him for time." Holmes crouched beside her, his tone low but piercing. "You entered his room last night, then?" She hesitated, eyes darting between us. "Yes," she whispered at last. "I went up after midnight, when all was quiet. I meant to plead with him, but when I reached his door, it was already open. He was lying there, still. I touched his hand. It was cold. I panicked. I thought if they found me there, they'd think me guilty. I shut the door and bolted it from within, then slipped through the loft to Keller's room. He never knew, I swear it." Lestrade gave a snort. "A fine story, madam. And how do you explain the flower, or the cord?" Mrs. Trent shook her head helplessly. "I saw no flower. As for the cord, I don't know where it came from." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, then rose, brushing the dust from his knees. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Every soul under this roof admits to part of the crime, yet none claim the act itself." He turned toward the fire, eyes glinting with that strange, fierce focus that always signaled his mind had taken flight along its invisible chain of logic. "Consider, Watson. Keller bribes the maid to open the door. The landlady admits to finding it open. The clergyman hears a scream and sees a woman's shadow, and yet the fatal knot was tied by a practiced hand, too steady for fear, too precise for haste. Each element true, but none complete." He took the candlestick from the mantel and held it before her. "Mrs. Trent, You are sure you never saw this before? She blinked through her tears. It's one of ours, sir. We keep them in the hall cupboard. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Then someone fetched it from below, someone who knew its place in darkness, a resident, not a guest. He turned abruptly to Lestrade. Summon Keller and the Reverend at once. Within minutes, the two men entered, the German pale and wary, the clergyman clutching his Bible as if it were a shield. Keller's gaze fell at once upon Mrs. Trent. What is this madness? Why is she here? Holmes's expression was cool. Because truth, Herr Keller, has begun to thaw, and I believe it will unearth us all before the storm clears. He set the candlestick down upon the table and withdrew from his pocket a thin scrap of paper creased and soot-stained. This, he said softly, I found in the ashes of the fire upstairs. You may recognize the handwriting. It is yours, Mr. Keller. Keller's composure faltered. A letter, yes, one of many I carry. What of it? It was addressed, Holmes continued, to Mr. Percival Hartright, dated 2 days before his death. It reads, Payment received, shipment dispatched. My assistant will see to the remainder. Keller's jaw tightened. It was business, nothing more. Holmes stepped closer, his gaze like a blade. Your assistant, Keller. Who is he? The German hesitated. A boy once in my employ, dismissed weeks ago for theft. Name? August Brandt. Holmes's voice dropped. Then it seems August Brandt did not forgive so easily. He arrived here last night before the storm, seeking his revenge. You brought him to the inn, perhaps unwittingly, perhaps not. He used your craft, your cord, your trade's tools, and left you to bear the blame. Keller's face drained of colour. You mean he's here? Holmes inclined his head. Still here. The snow has made certain of that. He turned sharply toward Lestrade. Search the cellar and the loft. Look for any sign of a man's concealment. Ashes, crumbs, prints in the dust. We hunt a craftsman, clever and desperate, with fingers fit for silk and a conscience frayed thin as thread. As Lestrade hurried off, Holmes's eyes returned to the candlestick, his voice soft but certain. Mark me, Watson, the truth lies not in who entered that room, but in who could never leave it. And before dawn breaks upon this cursed snow, we shall find the hand that tied the final knot. Holmes remained motionless as Lestrade and 2 constables, summoned from the nearby village, disappeared down the narrow stairway to the cellar. The air in the common room seemed to thicken with waiting. Keller sat rigid by the fire, his fingers locked together, while Mrs. Trent, pale and trembling, kept her eyes fixed on the floorboards as though afraid to look up. Only the wind spoke, rattling the shutters and whistling through the chimney with a sound that might have been a sigh or a warning. Holmes's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail. The lanterns flicker across the pewter mugs, the faint soot marks around the hearth, the faint trail of melted snow near the door. Watson, he said quietly, do you perceive the pattern of disturbance here? I followed his gaze. I see footprints from the constables, perhaps earlier from Keller, but, there, near the skirting board, a patch where the dust has been brushed aside. Just so, Holmes murmured. He knelt, running a long, thin finger along the disturbed line. A space recently occupied, perhaps by a small trunk, and the dust still clings to the edge. It has been moved within the hour. Mrs. Trent's breath caught audibly. That was in the corner, since before Christmas, sir. It belonged to one of the travellers. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Which traveller? The young man who arrived just before the storm, the one who said he'd go on to Birmingham when the road cleared. I thought he'd gone early yesterday morning. I never saw him since. Holmes rose swiftly, his expression alive with purpose. Gone?
Impossible. No one has left this house since the first snowfall. He turned toward Keller. This man, did you know him? Keller's lips parted, but no sound came. Then, in a low, strained voice, yes, August Brandt. For an instant, silence fell like a stone. Then Holmes's tone, though quiet, cut through the air like a knife. Then, gentlemen, the last thread draws taut. He seized the lantern from the table. Watson, come. We descended to the cellar, our steps echoing off the cold stone walls. The space below was cramped and damp, its ceiling low enough to force Lestrade to stoop. His lantern cast erratic shadows over barrels and sacks of coal. Nothing down here, Holmes? The inspector called, frustration in his tone. We've searched every corner. Holmes raised his lamp higher, the golden light glancing off a row of crates near the far wall. Every corner, Lestrade? He said softly. Look there. He pointed to a section of wall where the frost was strangely absent, as if heat had touched it recently. With the poker from the nearby coal heap, he rapped against the stone. A hollow sound answered. An alcove, I whispered. Holmes's eyes glimmered. Or a hiding place. He pressed along the edge until a concealed latch gave way, and the slab of wood that served as false masonry swung inward on a hidden hinge. A rank wave of stale air escaped, and the lantern light fell upon a crouched figure within. A young man, his fair hair matted, his eyes wild and defiant. In his hand was a short-bladed knife, the tip darkened with soot and wax. Lestrade lunged forward, but Holmes's voice stopped him cold. Do not startle him. He is cornered, and a cornered man strikes like an adder. The young man, Brandt, gave a bitter laugh. You found me soon enough, clever Englishman. His accent bore the same Germanic edge as Keller's, though rougher, harsher. But you're too late. The snow keeps the dead, not the living. Holmes stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the boy's trembling hand. You killed Percival Hartright. Brandt's eyes flickered, and for the first time uncertainty crept into them. He ruined us both, he spat. He cheated Keller, drove him to ruin. I followed him here to make him pay. I tied my own justice around his throat. Keller's voice, trembling, drifted from behind us. You fool, August. I would have forgiven you. I would have helped you. Brandt's expression twisted. Helped? You cast me out like filth. Holmes moved between them, calm as
ever. Enough. There has been blood enough for pride. In one smooth motion, he caught Brandt's wrist, the knife clattering to the floor. Your cleverness betrayed you, Brandt. The braided silk, the mark upon the frost, even the candlestick you used as your instrument. All the work of a craftsman too proud to hide his skill. Brandt sagged against the wall, the fight leaving him as Lestrade's men bound his hands. He deserved it, the youth muttered. He bought and sold men like ribbon. I gave him what he gave me, a noose of silk. Holmes regarded him a long moment, his voice low and strangely grave. Vengeance is but a knot drawn around one's own neck, my boy. You have only tightened it. As Brandt was led away, the cellar fell into silence, save for the muffled sob of Mrs. Trent above. Holmes extinguished his lantern, and in the sudden dark, his voice came quietly beside me. You see, Watson, even snow cannot bury guilt. It only delays the thaw. The storm raged still when we returned to the upper rooms, the windows rattling in their frames as though the house itself wished to shudder off its burden of secrets. Brandt had been secured in the small pantry, guarded by Lestrade's men, and the immediate tension that had hung over the inn seemed to loosen, though only slightly. Holmes stood by the hearth, his long, lean figure cast in shadow, the flicker of the flames catching the sharp angles of his face. His eyes, however, were far away, fixed not on the fire, but on some invisible horizon of thought. Lestrade, weary yet triumphant, removed his gloves and rubbed his hands before the heat. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "I'll grant it was a tricky one, but the thing's settled now. Brant's our man, clear as daylight. He'll hang for it once the courts thaw out. There's your proof, the cord, the confession, the candlestick." Holmes did not answer immediately. He lifted the poker and stirred the fire with a slow, deliberate motion. The sparks flared and fell like tiny embers of suspicion. "And yet," he said at last, "does daylight always bring clarity, Lestrade? Snow reflects the sun, but it blinds as easily as it reveals." Lestrade frowned. "What are you implying? We have his word, and Keller's too." Holmes turned sharply, his gaze piercing. "Exactly. We have words. A weapon more dangerous than any knife. Brant's confession fits too neatly, like a suit tailored after the body has been measured. He admits to everything, even what he could not possibly know." I looked up, startled. "You mean he's lying?" Holmes began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Partly, Watson. His hatred is genuine. His hand may even have drawn the cord. But the motive, the moment, and the manner do not align. Consider, he claims to have entered unseen, yet Maisie heard 2 voices. He says he killed for revenge, yet left behind a mark of trade rather than rage. And most tellingly, he knew
of the flower, a snowdrop that only Lestrade, Keller, and ourselves had seen. How could he name it unless it had been shown to him? Lestrade blinked. "You mean Keller told him?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Or arranged for him to tell us?" The inspector's jaw tightened. "You think Keller planned the whole affair?" "I think," Holmes said quietly, "that Herr Keller is a man who ties knots so others may hang from them." He moved to the window and drew the curtain aside. Outside, the snow whirled under a faint, bluish dawn. "Brant is a craftsman's fool, used, discarded, and now sacrificed to keep his master's hands clean. Look how every thread of evidence points to him, and none to Keller. It is too perfect. Real crimes, like real lives, are messy." Holmes turned suddenly, his eyes bright. "Watson, fetch the ledger from the victim's room." I obeyed at once, returning moments later with the thick volume. Holmes opened it to the page he had studied earlier. "Observe here the entry Keller made for EK and the payment in full. Yet the handwriting changes subtly near the bottom line. The pressure lightens, the ink thickens, and the loop of the K is reversed. This portion was added later. Keller tampered with the ledger to fabricate his dealings with Hartright. He sought to prove a connection where one no longer existed." Lestrade bent over it, squinting. "By heaven, you're right. But what of the motive?" Holmes's voice was grave. "Greed and fear. Hartright's records show he held a lien over Keller's business. The debt was due this week. Keller lured him here under the pretense of repayment, murdered him, then employed Brant to stage the scene. When the snow trapped them all, he found his chance to complete the illusion, feeding the boy lies, bribing the maid, and letting panic bury the truth." I stared, a shiver running through me despite the heat of the fire. "Then the snowdrop?" Holmes's expression softened, almost admiringly. "A flourish. The man is an artist of his own damnation. The flower was his mockery of purity, a signature only I was meant to read. And so I have." As though summoned by the weight of his words, the door creaked open, and Keller stepped hesitantly into the room. His face was pale, but his voice steady. "Inspector, may I speak with you? I fear I have misled you earlier." Holmes's smile was faint but cold. "Yes, Herr Keller.
I believe you have misled us all. Keller's composure faltered. He looked from Holmes to the fire, his hand trembling slightly at his side. You cannot prove... Holmes moved closer, his voice low, controlled and terrible in its certainty. I do not need to prove, sir. I can demonstrate. When we examined the candlestick, the wax bore traces of resin, a binding agent used in the sealing of imported silk packages. And on the base, beneath the soot, I found a speck of red thread, lion braid. You
used your own shipment to strangle him. A merchant's mark left by a murderer's vanity. Keller's breath came in shallow gasps. No, he did it, the boy. He confessed. Holmes's eyes glinted like steel. Indeed, because you rehearsed the confession with him. I believe he thought you'd spirit him away once the storm broke. Instead, you meant him to hang. There was a pause, a long, hollow silence, broken only by the roar of the wind outside. Then Keller's mask shattered. He lunged toward the fire, but Lestrade caught him by the arm, dragging him back. Holmes stood unmoving, his expression as cold as the snow beyond the glass. A pity, he said softly. The perfect knot has come undone. And as Keller was led away to join his unfortunate accomplice, the first light of morning crept across the frozen panes, glimmering faintly upon the single snowdrop still standing in its glass upon the mantel, untouched and quietly accusing. The dawn light creeping through the frost-streaked windows carried no warmth. It only lent the inn an eerie pallor, as if the night's confession still lingered, half frozen in the air. Keller, bound and silent, sat slumped near the hearth, his fine coat dusted with soot from his earlier struggle. Brant had been taken to the adjoining room under guard, though Holmes had insisted he not be removed until the roads were open. Let justice thaw at the same pace as the truth, he had said. Lestrade, though weary and wind-chafed, was still pacing, muttering about statements, charges, and the devil's work that men called silk. Holmes stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the grey dawn. I could tell by the stillness of his frame that the machinery of his mind had not ceased turning. You have him, Holmes, I ventured at last. There's nothing left to uncover. He did not turn. On the contrary, Watson, there is always something left. Crime, my dear fellow, is like snow. It covers the ground, but never changes the shape beneath. It deceives the eye into thinking all is level, when beneath it lie ridges, hollows, and unseen paths. Lestrade gave a weary sigh. If this is one of your riddles, I've had enough for one night. Keller's your man, and Brant's his fool. That's riddle enough for me. Holmes's eyes flicked toward him, the faintest smile ghosting his lips. You are correct, Inspector, but not complete. There remains one more element, one last footprint left in the snow, so to speak. He turned to Mrs. Trent, who lingered near the door, her face pale, hands clasped tight. Madam, you told me you entered Mr. Hartright's room after his death and locked it behind you. Yet you omitted something, the sound you heard while fleeing. She frowned in confusion. Sound, sir. The low scrape of wood, a drawer sliding shut. I found it half open later, and yet the contents, Hartright's letters, were in order. Someone else had entered after. You, when all believed the deed done. Her lips parted in shock. After? But who? Holmes's gaze returned to Keller. Our merchant was not content with murder alone. He sought to secure what Hartright carried, the documents of debt that gave the motive weight. He murdered his creditor, then rifled the papers to erase proof of his ruin. He would have burned them had the snow not made his chimney too narrow for flame. Keller lifted his head slowly, a dull defiance flickering in his eyes. You think yourself clever, Holmes, but even if all you say is true, who will weep for a man like Hartright? He cheated me, ruined many. I gave him only what he earned. Holmes's tone was cold as the frost outside. Retribution is a trade best left to higher courts, sir, not the marketplace. You wrapped justice in silk and strangled it with your own hand. Keller said nothing more. His eyes fixed on the fire, where the embers glowed like dying eyes. Lestrade signalled his men, and they hauled the prisoner to his feet. The man went without resistance, though not without a final, hollow glance at Holmes, a mixture of hate, admiration, and something like envy. When they had gone, the inn fell into a profound stillness. Only the wind persisted, though even that seemed to weaken as morning pressed through the mist. Holmes drew his coat around him and looked once more at the snowdrop upon the mantel. "Curious," he said softly. "The purest things often bloom beside the darkest acts. Nature has an irony sharper than any man's wit." I could not help but smile faintly despite the weariness in my limbs. "You've a poet's heart under that logic, Holmes." He turned to me with that familiar gleam that was half amusement, half rebuke. "Poetry, Watson, is but observation dressed for company. Logic is its undressed form." He took up his hat and gloves. "Come, the train will be dug free by noon. Lestrade will have his victory and Scotland Yard its headlines. We, meanwhile, shall have breakfast, cold ham and reason." As we stepped out into the bitter air, the snow lay smooth again, as if the night's violence had never been. Yet somewhere beneath that white silence, the prints of men's folly remained, hidden but never erased. Holmes paused, gazing down the road, where the first cart was clearing a path through the drift. "The case of the Snowbound Killer, Watson," he said with a faint smile. A tidy name, though the killer himself was undone by the very thing he thought his ally, the storm. It sealed his world too tightly, leaving no room for escape. He looked up, his breath visible in the pale morning light. "There's a lesson there, I think. No chain, however cleverly woven, can bind forever. Every knot, given time and truth, will come undone." And with that, we turned our steps toward the station, leaving the inn and its ghosts behind, while the snow, gentle now, fell once more, softly.
Burying the last traces of a crime born in silence and ended, as ever, in the shadow of Sherlock Holmes's unerring mind. The train hissed and groaned as it drew from the station, its wheels protesting the cold with every turn. Holmes and I sat alone in the compartment, the snow-bound countryside sliding past the window in long, white ribbons. I watched the landscape for a time, then turned to my companion. He had sunk into his corner with the familiar indolence that came only after a case fully resolved, the slackened posture, the half-lidded eyes, the fingertips pressed together in thought's afterglow. Yet I knew from long experience that his mind, though seemingly at rest, was still dissecting every strand of the affair. "You are unusually quiet, Holmes," I said, "even for one who has just snatched a murderer from the very jaws of the storm." He opened one eye, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. "My silence, my dear Watson, is not from satisfaction but reflection. This case, though neatly tied, carries a note of melancholy. The snow covered not only crime but desperation, a tapestry of ruin, deceit, and misjudged loyalty. I find little triumph in it." I frowned slightly. And yet the evidence was conclusive. Keller's guilt, his tampering with the ledger, his use of the cord from his own trade, his manipulation of that poor boy. Surely it was a victory for reason. "Reason, yes," he replied softly. "But reason, when faced with hunger and humiliation, can seem cruel. Keller was a man driven by despair as much as by greed. Had he possessed less intelligence, he might have simply fled. It was his very cunning that betrayed him, his pride in the perfection of his design. He shifted, leaning forward, his eyes now alight with that analytical gleam that always followed the storm's calm. "Did you note, Watson, how the snow itself was both accomplice and witness? It imprisoned all suspects in the same space, concealed their movements, and yet, paradoxically, made deceit impossible. No man could step into that white silence without leaving his confession behind him." I smiled faintly. "You mean the snow forced the truth to remain within the house?" "Precisely. It made liars of those who claimed freedom and prisoners of those who believed themselves innocent. Keller's undoing began the moment he imagined the storm would erase his trail. Nature has her own brand of justice." He withdrew his pipe and struck a match, the small flame illuminating the sharp planes of his face. "You see, Watson, the case was not about the mechanics of murder. That was straightforward enough. An improvised strangulation, a false scene, a convenient scapegoat. What interested me was the psychology of concealment. Each person in that house told a version of truth designed to protect themselves. The maid feared dismissal, the landlady feared ruin, the clergyman feared scandal, and Keller feared poverty more than
Prison. Each lie interlocked like the loops on that window pane until one tug brought the entire design to light. I watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling, the rhythmic pulse of the train filling the silence between us. "And Brandt?" I asked quietly. "The boy will face trial, of course." Holmes's expression softened. "Lestrade will see him charged as an accessory. But I have written to Mycroft already. Perhaps the Home Office will find reason for mercy. He was a pawn in another man's game. It would be unjust to hang a craftsman for the design of his master." We fell silent after that. The train pushed on, the rhythmic clatter fading into the hypnotic hum of wheels and wind. I thought of the King's Morrow Inn, of the flickering firelight upon pale faces, of the snowdrop gleaming on the mantel, a fragile emblem of innocence surviving amidst guilt. Holmes stirred again and glanced out the window. The snow was thinning now, giving way to bare fields glinting beneath the sun. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "in the end, truth is much like that flower, fragile, easily buried, yet persistent enough to bloom even through frost. One must only know where to dig." He smiled faintly, tucking his pipe away as the train whistled for the next station. "And now, if I mistake not, Mrs. Hudson's breakfast will be waiting by the time we return to Baker Street. A case, a meal, and a few hours of silence. 3 luxuries that make life tolerable to an untidy mind." As London's smudged skyline emerged from the silver mist, I looked once more at my friend, the brilliant, impenetrable man who found logic in chaos and calm in calamity. His eyes were distant, but the faintest spark of satisfaction lingered there. When at last we stepped onto the platform, Holmes drew up his collar against the chill and murmured almost to himself, "The snow may cover the footprints of men, Watson, but it cannot conceal their motives. Those remain etched in frost, awaiting only the sun." And with that final aphorism, half poetry, half truth, Sherlock Holmes strode through the lingering fog of the city, leaving me once again to marvel at the curious and relentless genius of the man.